The saying goes, ignorance is bliss. If you don't know about it, you don't have to worry about it. But what happens when ignorance leads to riots, or even violence, or maybe protests? And what about discrimination? Is it still bliss then? Racial inequality within America is nothing new. However, what is new is white America's knowledge of such inequalities. Prior to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, inequality was well known amongst white America, and oftentimes it was even fought to maintain it. However, there's been a shift within America's knowledge. You see, the Civil Rights Movement has created this shift, and we've gone into an era that I will token today in my speech as racial inequality ignorance. Now, this is a pretty bold claim, and you may ask, what's my evidence for this? And here it is. In 1961, a poll was conducted that asked white correspondents whether they knew about the Freedom Riders and if they knew their cause. In 1961, 89% of these 89% of white correspondents said that they knew the Freedom Riders' cause and they knew who they were, but only 6% said that they didn't know. Now, the Freedom Riders' cause obviously was for racial equality. So the knowledge of this cause for racial equality suggests a knowledge that inequalities existed, because otherwise, why would there be a cause for equality? Furthermore, there was another question in the same poll that asked, do you think mass demonstrations by the Negroes will help or hurt the Negroes' cause? Now, the very wording of this question by causing a cause for equality suggests that there's a knowledge of inequalities. Now, even though 64% of correspondents said that it would hurt the cause, none of them deny that there was a cause for equality, meaning that they all knew that inequalities existed. However, this is simply not the case anymore, and this has been shown in polls done by Gallup and CNN as recently. Gallup asked a question recently that said, asking the satisfaction levels towards the treatment of African Americans. Now, white correspondents said 44% of them said that they were either dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with the treatment of African Americans, while a much larger majority, 68% of African Americans, said that they were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. This shows a clear divide in the experience that white Americans and black Americans are experiencing and how knowledgeable each one is of it. And this has been shown by CNN in multiple of their questions asking about whether or not racism is still a widespread issue, or if African Americans are treated less fairly in the workplace, or whether or not the justice system favors white Americans. We see this divide in every single one of these polls. So the question is no longer whether or not a shift has occurred, but why the shift. You see, prior to the 1960s, there were visual signs of inequality everywhere. You see, even in this classroom right here, we would have white Americans sitting up here and black Americans sitting in the back. You would go to the bathroom and you would see white sections and black sections. You would go to the restaurants and you would either have whites sitting and you would have blacks standing, and oftentimes blacks were not even allowed in. However, the 1964 Civil Rights Act did away with many of these visual inequalities. It now outlawed discriminating based on race. So many of these visual signs disappeared. However, as we can see by the polls, the inequalities still remained. Furthermore, segregation of schools had a large part to do with it. Just recently, there was a study done by a Harvard researcher that showed that racism was learned young and it was also reinforced at a young age. So segregating schools led to one group feeling superior while another felt inferior. So already at a very young age, they knew inequality existed. And so as you grew up, as these people grew up, it was easy to acknowledge inequalities because it was normalized at such a young age. But once again, Brown versus Board of Education erased this. And yet these inequalities still remain, they haven't disappeared. Furthermore, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had a large impact on erasing yet another visual sign of inequality. Prior to the Voting Rights Act, there was Jim Crow laws in the South, and many of these laws said that there was poll taxes and literacy tests that were needed for African Americans to be able to vote. But yet again, it was easy to point at that time because it was written law. However, the Voting Rights Act made it disappear. Now, ladies and gentlemen, racial inequality ignorance is dangerous. As we've seen, anger is boiling over and people are upset. There's one group that's hurting and another group that's simply not seeing it in the way that they used to. In order for us to make social stability and gain and be able to move forward as a society, there must be another shift within knowledge. Because, ladies and gentlemen, ignorance is bliss when you don't have to worry about it. However, when there's riots, protests, and violence, then there becomes an issue. Racial inequality must go, because ignorance is bliss, but knowledge is crucial. Thank you.